Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for the Writing an Impactful Annual Report for Victim Assistance Grantee under the VOCA program. My name is Tina Dimashki. I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Specialist, providing contractor support to OVC and OVC grantees around performance management and performance measure reporting. During today's session, you will hear about, we will talk about collecting and monitoring performance measurement tools to PMT data and how it can inform your annual report. We will then discuss annual performance reporting tips and tricks to guide you through completing your annual report. And we will examine the reporting questions, all 22 of them, and how a powerful response would look like. And at the end, I would like to receive your feedback. I will be sharing some resources with you all and also our contact information so you can reach out to us. So we will go ahead and start with how to tell a story from the quarterly data. The quarterly data is what you and your subgrantees are submitting on a quarterly basis to OVC throughout the fiscal year. And the annual report is what you submit as state award administrators at the end of the fiscal year, at the end of the reporting for the entire fiscal year. So if you look at this map right here, we start out with data collection, and we're looking at a performance management approach and a larger umbrella approach to the performance measures. We start out with data collection. We then have the data collected and we submit the reports. There's tracking involved. You're analyzing the data. Our analysts are looking at the data. Everybody's looking at the data, and it's entered on time every quarter. However, there's a lot more than just those numbers in that data when you're focusing on the performance management approach. And that is the story behind what the numbers mean. And all the information that you as SAAs, as state award administrators have, and all this knowledge that you carry with you around the data, whether it's at the state level or from working with your sub-grantees on the local level and really understanding what's going on in your communities and how what is going on in the communities translates into the numbers that you provide to OVC. So the first piece of making sure that you are creating and submitting a powerful and impactful annual narrative or annual report is by focusing on performance management at the state level, but also with your subgrantees, creating performance management plans with your subgrantees and explaining to your subgrantees what performance management looks like on the subgrantee level and how collecting data accurately and providing logical data will establish a story for your subgrantee that they can then be sharing with you all, and you can then deliver that to OVC. So performance management, when you're identifying goals and objectives with your subgrantee and you're continuously communicating with your subgrantee on those goals and objectives and ensuring that there is data that is collected for those goals, you can then understand the work that your grantees are doing at the local level and be able to extract that information from them and then turn it into a comprehensive report and a comprehensive response for your different annual questions. So keep in mind performance management and know that performance management is not something that has a time frame on it, like quarterly performance management or annual performance management as these reports are. Performance management is ongoing and it's throughout the life cycle of the sub-award and the larger award. You should be thinking about performance management throughout the entire year that you are working with your subgrantee, and you should be monitoring their performance. With that, we also want to encourage you to be thinking of the annual reporting questions throughout the year. This is not something that you should only focus on right before December 30th when the annual reports are due. You should be thinking about what am I going to put into my performance or my annual reports based on the performance management plans, based on the goals and objectives that my subgrantees are reaching and completing that would inform my OVC grant managers. So thinking specifically about the performance measurement tool data set, the PMT, and that data that is being collected in the PMT and submitted to OVC. Victim assistance grantees and their subgrantees report out on population demographics, direct services, and subgrantees' annual report outcomes. So those are the three pieces that you will need to speak to in the annual reports. Grantees are encouraged to review each of these three pieces and speak to them and explain what the outcomes and what the data is saying. You will be able to, if you review the three question sets and you look at the population demographics that was collected, you look at the direct service numbers that's being collected, and also your subgrantees' responses to the annual reported outcomes, you will be able to speak to specific successes and challenges in the annual report. You will be able to speak to data increases and decreases and what those mean, because our analysts would not understand what those mean at the state level and at the local level because they are not engaged with your subgrantees and with yourselves. You'll also be able to speak to any new initiatives and projects and deliverables and resources that the subgrantee and your organization at the state level have been involved in, and how that looks through direct services and the population demographics and those annual responses. You also will be able to focus on statewide efforts and highlight or local community highlights in general that you can speak to, and you can then tie it back to that data that was being collected throughout the year. An impactful annual report is one that includes these three different items. There you will be describing, you will be indicating, and you will be highlighting. So grantees are encouraged to describe the conditions or any events that have affected the goals and objectives throughout the year. And again, I repeat throughout the year because this is very important. It is difficult to go back and try and remember what happened for the subgrantee and for the state award administering agency throughout 12 months of reporting. But if you're thinking about it throughout the year, you can make sure that you highlight different items and that you keep track of different items throughout the year that you would like to speak to at the end of the year, and you can follow through with those items as well. You should be describing significant outreach efforts and how the funds were publicized on state and local levels to raise victim awareness of available services. There's a few different words in here. We're talking about funding, so focus on where what happened with the funding, how did your state's awareness of victim services and the services that have become available because of the funding through your subgrantees or through the state specifically. Focusing on these different items will help your grant manager understand where the funding was or what the funding was dedicated to, and how you were able to work to raise awareness of victim services in the victim services field with the funding. You should be indicating that if your organization and the subgrantees were on track fiscally and programmatically to complete the goals and objectives, and if there are any unmet needs or unmet goals and objectives that you think OVC needs to be aware of and that OVC can assist you with. You should also be indicating what grant activity is being put into sustainability efforts, if any throughout the year, or how you and your subgrantees envision sustaining the efforts that were created or started with the VOCA funding that you have received. If sustainability is presenting to be a challenge, you should also be indicating that and ensuring that you share your needs with OVC so they can be aware and they can explain, your grant managers can then relay that information to OVC decision makers and leadership so they can understand what is going on in your state better. You should also make sure that you're highlighting collaborative partnerships and multidisciplinary responses and approaches to victim services. And you should also talk about activity around the priority areas and the underserved populations. Highlight the priority areas, which are domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse, and also the underserved populations, so VC can understand where the funding is going and which populations are lacking funding, and what information they need to extract from your state to be able to implement better funding streams and be aware of future funding opportunities at the federal level. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tips and tricks for the annual reports. The annual reports, as I said, cover grant activity for an entire federal fiscal year. This includes the grantee activity and the subgrantee activity for a sub-award or sub-grant award report for that period, so the SARs that have been completed for that period. The federal fiscal year starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. So even though your report, the annual reports are due on December 30th, the grant activity that is being described in those annual reports will speak to the October 1st through September 30th of that year. Because you are completing, or the annual reports are completed in the PMT, there needs to be a little bit of working with the language to ensure that you are within the character limit. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But beginning with the language, be sure that you are concise and you are explaining exactly what quarter you're referring to, what fiscal year you're referring to, and what organization you are referring to. Remember that you are working every single day on these awards and working with your subgrantees, as are your subgrantees, but your grant manager is not. Your grant manager has multiple awards, multiple programs and states that they are working with and they are responsible for at OVC, that they will need that level of detail of understanding what time frame you are referring to, which organization you're referring to, and any initiatives that you are speaking to need all to be identified and explained comprehensively. Identifying a fiscal year could be abbreviated into FY21, as you see on the screen here. Fiscal year 21 could be FY21. Your quarters, you could list them out as Q1, Q2, to buy some space or to have some space in the response field. But you are encouraged to be as descriptive and informative as possible when you're providing your answers. Be sure to avoid using the first-person pronouns. Remember that you as a staff within your organization are not the one that is reporting out to OVC. Your organization is on behalf of your state as it relates to the VOCA funding. So be sure to avoid the first pronoun, speak to your organization, say, our organization, Organization X, did this, completed that, and steer clear of saying, I completed these new forms that I then submitted, because you are speaking on behalf of your organization, and this is not a report that should be completed by one individual staff member. Be specific when you also speak to the data from the PMT and make sure that you have supporting evidence from the PMT. So if you're speaking to any increases or decreases in direct services, highlight what you're exactly referring to. Indicate the numbers that you're referring to and the question set that you're speaking to, and the time frame, as I said, of where the increases and decreases were seen. For the character limit specifically, we encourage grantees to create their responses in a Word document using plain text, because the answer fields in the PMT only accept plain text. So no special characters will be included in your annual response or in your narrative responses within the PMT question answer field. So you could create them in a Word document, make any edits, make sure that there are no errors or typos, and then you would just copy each question or each answer to each question and paste it in the PMT answer bank. Be sure to save your responses frequently because the system does time out after 30 minutes of inactivity. So if you are not using a Word document and you are creating your responses directly in the PMT, be sure to hit save and continue as many times as you can so you don't lose any of those responses. Also, there are 22 questions in the annual report, and all 22 of them require an answer in order to be able to submit the annual report in the PMT. Be sure to answer every question. Some of them are yes and no questions. We will go over those in the upcoming slides, but be sure to answer all of them. NA, or not applicable, is not a good answer. It's not a comprehensive answer. You should always steer clear of an NA answer and be sure to explain why you don't have a response to a specific question instead of just saying it does not apply. And we will talk a little bit more about that. Something to consider that would make your annual report more impactful and have powerful responses within the report is working as a team when creating responses. I mentioned this in the previous slide very briefly, but this is not a report to be completed by one individual. Even if your organization has one individual that does the administrative side of the grant reporting or has one designated person that reports out to OVC. These annual questions and responses should be worked on as a team because your different state award administrators or grant managers at the state level are working with so many different local subgrantees and have so many different experiences and perspectives to lend to each question. So you should be working together to identify any accomplishments on the local and state level that were achieved using grant funding over the past year. You should be working together to talk about any areas of opportunity that were identified. And you'd be surprised at how many connections you can form across subgrantees and across different perspectives when you start answering the questions together. You should also make sure that your leadership is involved in these reports. The semi-annual responses need to also indicate if there are any changes occurring in your organization and statewide or at the local level. Leadership should be involved to speak to any organizational changes that would affect the VOCA award deliverables that you are completing for OVC. And also, it's great to include a team because you don't really know what you don't know. You might think that you as a staff member know everything about the VOCA funding that you are receiving and that you can be as comprehensive and inclusive as possible in your responses. But knowing from my own previous experience, that is not the case, and sometimes we miss a lot in those responses if we don't share with our colleagues and work together as a team to provide an organizational response. What you also should be doing with your team is reviewing the performance measures together as you address them in the narrative responses. Review them across subgrantees and look for any similarities and any differences, any striking similarities and differences that you see across subgrantees. Look for, as I mentioned previously, the increases and the decreases in the data across grantees that you can then speak to. This is something that you should be doing on a quarterly basis, not at the end of the fiscal year when your annual reports are due. You should be focusing on identifying similarities and differences across subgrantees and understanding why that is and having conversations with your subgrantees to discuss why the increases and decreases exist so you can be most informed when you are reporting out to OVC. Speaking to your subgrantees about their goals and objectives and going back to that performance management plan that you had created at the beginning of a sub-award report should be at the forefront of thinking of the annual responses and something that you do often with your subgrantees. So again, at the end of the year, it's not trying to compile all this information that you've gathered in your head and trying to create an impactful report with not remembering what happened in the first quarter or in the second quarter. So be mindful of that. What I'd like to do now is go over the different questions in the in the annual report. The first question in the annual report that state award administrators have to answer is on the screen here: were any administrative and training funds used during the reporting period? This is a yes or no question. If you answer no, you would move on to question 2. If you answer yes, you are asked to briefly describe what those funds were used for. Should be a short answer. You could always provide additional information, but you're going to explain if you used administrative funds and if you used training funds and what exactly were those used for. You could say you used administrative funds to support some of the salaries for the SAAs during that period or during a specific period of time throughout the fiscal year, and you could use training funds for something such as training state award administrators around the PMT and how to use the PMT where you required some funding to do so. This is a very simple, basic response. There might be plenty of other ways that you would use administrative and training funds, but this is just an example to show you what is required for this one question if you were to briefly describe what the funds were used for. Then when we speak to questions 2 through 7, these are your educational activities, and this is where you would need to provide some data, but then also some responses, written responses. So question 2 asks if administrative funds supported any education activities during the reporting period. Again, this is a yes or no question. If the administrative funds did not support any education activities, you would move on to question 8 and you would not respond to questions 3 through 7. However, if you did, or if the administrative funds were used for education activities, you will need to provide a number for questions 3 through 5, asking about a number of requests received for educational activities, the number of people trained or those who attended the education events during the reporting period, which is the entire fiscal year, and then 5, the number of education events conducted during the reporting period. Then you have questions 6 and 7, and those require a narrative response. This is where you will have the 5,000 character limit to respond. I do also want to remind you that the 5,000 character limit includes spaces as well. So this takes a little bit away from the space allotted to respond. So keep that in mind when you're crafting your responses. Question 6 asks our grantees to describe any program or educational materials developed during the reporting period. This is where you are encouraged to describe what exactly was developed as in relation to the program developed or any materials developed, and then speak to them. So you have examples here of postcards, media, brochures, websites, and apps. Generic response would be explaining what was developed and not speaking further to what it was for or how it was used. So you could say, created brochures and leave it at that. That is not a good response. That is a response that is lacking information for your grant manager. A better response would be saying, we created 700 brochures using grant funding, and those 700 brochures were distributed at multiple schools for the purposes of raising awareness for this event in order to receive a high number of participants. That is a more informative response, and that explains to your OVC grant manager where the materials went, what the funding was used for, and what the outcome of having the educational materials developed was. Question number 7 asks to describe any planning or training events held during the reporting period. This is also an example where you can say, we held 5 planning events throughout the reporting period, and that would be you responding to this question number 7. However, that is not a powerful response that does not give the OVC grant manager needed information to be able to review your funding and to be informed about what happened with your state with the federal funding. A better response would be explaining that you held 5 different planning events for the purposes of identifying space for the education activities, identifying an audience, or completing all coordination for the events, and explaining who was involved around staff members or community partners or just partners in general for the planning or training events, and what the outcome of those events was. So your grant manager can really understand what the educational activities were for and what came from the educational activities and all the work that took place for those educational activities behind the scenes. You can see here between question 6 and 7, having an informed response and explaining and providing time frames and a more comprehensive response will show the hard work that you all have completed over the reporting period and within each quarter and over the fiscal year. Whereas if you just provide 2 to 3 word answers, that really takes away from all the work that you and your staff and your organization are doing every day to ensure that these VOCA funds are being utilized to the best of your abilities. The next set of questions, as you see here, we tried to put the questions under a specific topic. They are not in order within the report. However, some of them do fall in together, so it's easier to look at them together. So the second set of questions are focused around coordination activities. Those are questions 8, 11, and 13. We'll start with question 8. You see here, question 8 asks, did the grant support any coordination activities with other service providers, law enforcement agencies, etc., during the reporting period? So question 8 is a yes or no answer. So once you respond to question 8, you will then move on to the other questions, but then keep in mind that when you get to question 11, which asks you to describe any coordinated responses or services for assisting victims, crime victims during the reporting period, this is where you're sharing information about that response that you provided in question 8. So your response was yes to question 8. You will then describe what coordination or coordinated responses have taken place. Think about domestic violence response teams, sexual assault response teams, or any critical incident response teams within your state that you are aware of that have received any federal funding with these VOCA funds, and how to explain the work that they've done together. Whether it's a specific incident where they needed to respond together, and you can speak to that if funds were provided, or if it was a policy that was worked on across subgrantees or between a subgrantee and the state award administrator or administering agency. Or also if there was any outreach done between different organizations on the local level, you could speak to that. An example for this would be that I can provide from previous experience working with OVC funding is when we were working with different domestic violence organizations within the local community and the local police department or law enforcement agency, and we worked together to create a standalone sexual assault policy that had never been created for this specific police organization that I was working with. And what we did is we used feedback from the different domestic violence organizations and other organizations within the community to really make sure that the policy was inclusive of what the community needs were, and that the different community partners had a say and had a voice in that policy for the police department. This was a huge coordinated effort for that community, and they were able to speak to it in describing the coordination activities and help their OVC grant manager understand the level of effort that it took, but also explaining the success that came from it on a multitude platforms. There was success for victims of crime that are receiving services around sexual assault, but also there was success on the relationship building level across the different victim service providers and the law enforcement agency, and really learning how to work together and how to create additional opportunities for collaboration in the future. And I know the grant manager was very appreciative of getting to really understand what went on and how this was achieved, but also feeling like they were a part of this specific effort because of the detailed response that was provided. Question 13 asks the grantees to describe ways that your agency promoted the coordination of public and private efforts within the community to help crime victims during the reporting period. This is also another question around coordination activities, and it speaks to your specific organization. Now, even though it's asking on the state level, you could tie in the sub-awards and the sub-grantees that you worked with to speak to public and private efforts within the community. You could speak on a broader scale, and you can also speak to specific cases and incidents and survivors and victims that have been highlighted throughout the year for your community that you would like to share with OVC to show the work that you all have been involved in. The second set of questions would be questions 9 and 14, and those talk about improvements. Again, as I said previously, the questions are not in order, but since they all really connect together, and as you're writing a story and thinking in terms of writing a story, you can just keep your response going between the different questions, and I'll explain what I mean in a second. So question 9 asks the grantee to describe any program policies that changed during the reporting period. So this is where you can speak to policies on the state level within your organization or with different state organizations that you are working with. Again, around the VOCA funding, this has to be something that you're doing around VOCA funding, whether it's through using the funds or that it would impact the funds in any way, or the work being completed by the funds at the state level in any way. An answer that should not be provided to OVC is NA, as I said previously, not applicable. Even if there were no policies that changed during the reporting period, you should speak to the fact that there weren't any policies during that reporting period, because we're speaking to an entire year. So if there were no improvements, in question 9, instead of saying NA or there were no improvements or there were no policies, grantees should explain why that is. So a comprehensive response would be, although no policies were changed or created during the reporting period or over the past year, we are working towards X, Y, and Z. We are working towards creating a policy, or we are having meetings around changing a policy or updating the specific item that would fall under our VOCA funding umbrella. So even though a response might be a no, that doesn't mean that that should be the response and that you would move on to the next question, because that does not help your grant manager understand what is going on at the state level. A no means that you did not put any effort into any program policies for an entire year at the state level, nor did your subgrantees. And that is not the case because you all are so busy working on policy changes. Your subgrantees are as well, to try and improve the victim services field. So explaining that instead of putting NA or putting no or nothing has changed would be very beneficial, not only for your state and receiving additional funding in the future, but for OVC grant managers to really be able to understand what is happening at the state level. Question 14 asks grantees to describe any notable activities at the grantee level during the reporting period that improved delivery of victim services. This one's specific to victim services. and an improvement in victim services. However, again, if you cannot think of notable activities and you have not been able to extract any notable activities from your subgrantees that you could speak to over the entirety of the reporting period, which is the fiscal year, you can speak to needs, any unmet needs or any improvements that you'd like to see that would have been helpful had they had taken place or had they have happened. You could also tie the response from question 9 to this response in question 14. You could speak to policies around improving victim service delivery. So this is how a way to be able to tell a story and keep your the conversation going throughout your annual report. Questions 10 and 19 are around media coverage and outreach. So for those two, question 10 asks to describe any earned media coverage events and episodes during the reporting period. So this one, I think it's such a low-hanging fruit of a question. We do receive a lot of NA and no media coverage happened over the year, but again, this one, if you just do a little bit of digging or if you speak to your subgrantees and ask what they have done at the local level around media coverage, you would be able to pull up some information that you can share with your grant manager. This is where you can post links, refer your grant manager to a news article or a video that was created or multiple things around victim services within a community that falls under your VOCA funding or that's receiving funding from the state under the VOCA program. And then for number 19, explain your state process to publicize its victim assistance funding for services to victims of crime during the reporting period. So some responses that we've received are very similar throughout the different fiscal years. And this is because you're explaining a state process, and sometimes these processes don't change. However, we encourage you to not only explain the state process, but also speak to any publicity campaigns that your subgrantees have completed or something that you'd like to highlight that has made statewide or has had statewide attention or community-wide attention throughout the subgrantees. So even though it could look like the response will be the same every year, if nothing's changed, you could definitely tailor that response annually and make sure that you're providing more context and information to your grant manager. Questions 12, 17, 18, and 21 talk about challenges and opportunities. We'll go through each one, but this is where we ask our grantees to be as transparent and open and honest as possible with OVC. These questions will teach the grant managers so much, and they will be able to share with OVC leadership so much around what is going on with the funding and where the needs are for the future of the funding through OVC. So be mindful of that. These questions are not to hold you accountable in the future and saying, hey, these are the challenges. Why are you not working to fix these challenges? Why have you not taken on these opportunities or made any changes knowing and having identified these opportunities? This is merely for OVC to understand what the victim services field looks like at the state and local level, and to be able to be responsive to the field through providing additional funding, through providing a different type of funding where possible in order to make sure that they are meeting the needs of the field and staying true to the OVC mission. So question 12 asks the grantee to discuss the major issues in your state that either assisted or prevented victims from receiving assistance during the reporting period. This one, again, it's a huge opportunity for you at the state level to identify and to explain to OVC any issues that are whether they're specific to your state or specific to a local community or city or a jurisdiction within your state, or if it's a national issue that you got to experience as well. This is where you would indicate that to OVC to help them understand especially around preventing victims from receiving assistance during a reporting period, understanding why and what exactly happened. If you have examples to provide from specific victims or survivors or communities, that would only help your annual report be more impactful and help OVC understand the issue better. Question 17 asks you to identify any emerging issues or notable trends affecting victim service, crime victim services in your state during the reporting period. So this one is where basically OVC needs your help in identifying emerging issues, things that you're seeing, any trends across the data that is, let's say, numbers for domestic violence services are decreasing, and you're noticing that. An example of this would be during the first year of the pandemic, when a lot of hotline calls for service through hotlines increased, but then in-person services had decreased. Obviously, this was because a lot of offices had closed down. They were only doing teleservices and could not see victims in person. But that was a huge change that had the states not been explaining to OVC what was going on, OVC would not have been in the know as much, and your grant managers would not have been able to work with the different states in identifying new creative ways to still support the victims using the VOCA funding. Question 18 asks grantees to previously outline any staffing retention issues that victim assistance programs have, or why these issues may have occurred during the reporting period. This is also, again, where we encourage you to be as transparent as possible, because we know across the board over VOCA programs and in the victim services field in general, we have seen and we continue to see a lot of staff turnover and a lot of retention issues. And helping OVC understand why and what is happening at your organization's level, but also at the local level across organizations and subgrantees that you've worked with will help them decide the future of the funding and where the funding should go and how it should be allocated moving forward. Question 21 refers to gaps in services during the reporting period. Again, this is a huge question where having an impactful response will go a very long way for your grant managers as they learn about the states that they support and the communities that you all support, and be able to really tie the dots across the states and understanding what the gaps in services are across the states when dedicating funding. Okay, so questions 15 and 20 are those around the priority and underserved areas. So question 15 asks the grantee to discuss each priority area in which VOCA funding has been used to assist crime victims during the reporting period. So this is where you're going to speak to each priority area. Don't just focus on one. Don't say something along the lines that all the priority areas were met. We assisted victims in all priority areas with VOCA funding. That is not helpful. We want to hear more about what exactly was done at the state level and the local level around sexual assault, around child abuse, around domestic assault, and what the underserved population that your state was focusing on is looking like. So we want more information and we want detailed information. And if you can provide examples and use a survivor's voice in speaking to these responses, that would help OVC better understand what is happening and better understand your story and be able to connect the dots for your state. Question 20 asks to explain how your state was able to direct funding to new and underserved populations during the reporting period. So if you run out of space in question 15 when you're addressing the underserved population, you can definitely continue your response in question 20, or you can focus that response in question 20 to the new and underserved population. And how you were able to direct funding to that, whether it's through specific subgrantees that are providing specific services to the underserved populations that were identified, or throughout any outreach or awareness campaign to be able to reach those underserved populations within your state. So providing examples would be very, very helpful in this case. Then we have some additional questions that don't really fall into a specific topic, and those are questions 16 and 22. Question 16 asks to describe the efforts taken to serve victims of federal crimes during the reporting period. The amount of times that our grantees have responded with saying we have state policies that ensure that federal victims are receiving services has been really increasing with each report. And I encourage you to look more into that question and to provide a more accurate and more explanatory response to this question around what type of efforts, not just saying we have a policy in place, explain what the policy is. If there are any cases that you can highlight, of course, we never want to include any personal identifying information, but if you can speak to a specific case while redacting all that information and explain to OVC what it looks like to serve victims of federal crimes within your state and through your sub-awards, that would really help your grant managers understand what you're doing for victims of crime, federal victims of, or victims of federal crimes. And then they'd be able to connect the dots across states to see where a state needs any assistance and how to connect them with another SAA to better learn about the process that's in place in that state. Question 22 asks to list any outcome measures that are reported to the governor, legislature, or other state entity during the reporting period. Again, NA is not, that's not an answer that should be entered here, nor should states just explain that no measures were reported. I've seen this answer a lot, and there's so much that you could include in this answer if you just reword what the question is asking. Outcome measures reported to the governor, to other state entities, there's so much you can speak to around how you're using the measures or the outcomes of the victim assistance funding from subgrantees and at the state level, and how you're sharing it with state entities and how you're working collaboratively and sharing with state leadership on the work that's being done around victim services. I'd like to take a moment. I know we have just a few more things to cover, but I'd like to take a moment to ask our attendees to think about what is going on in your state and all the monitoring that you've done for your subrecipients. And if you're doing monitoring right now before your reporting period, think of a major issue in your state that either assisted or prevented victims from receiving assistance during the fiscal year that you'll be reporting on in the annual report come December. So just take a moment and think about one issue that you would be responding to for question 12. And if you'd like, please include it in the chat so we can get ideas and for others to be able to see. I see a lack of housing and overcrowded shelters. Thank you for sharing that. Reductions in funding availability, causing loss of direct service staff at multiple agencies. Absolutely, staffing has been an issue for many of our states and our subgrantees. And continued closures and court closures due to COVID is also one that you could speak to. This is fantastic. So you already have ideas of what you can speak to. And if you don't, if this question caught you off guard and you don't have any issues that you can speak to off the top of your mind, this is a reminder to start thinking about that and think about it early before you start responding to your annual report, so you can have a substantive response for OVC. Another item I wanted you to think about is those priority areas. So choose one of the sentences on the screen, whether it's this grant funding has allowed for or this grant funding has positively impacted victim services by providing, and complete the answer in the chat box to just kind of get a practice run around responding to these questions. Okay, so while you are doing that, I will move on to just speaking quickly about subgrantees. So we talked about needing to have a performance management plan in place with subgrantees, talking about goals and objectives with subgrantees and ensuring that they are part of this process and that you're speaking to them and you're monitoring your subgrantees and seeing where you can extract information from your subgrantees at the local level and include it in your annual report for grant managers to better understand the grant activity that's taking place in your state. 2 questions that your subgrantees have to answer to at the end of the reporting period, so in quarter 4, are the challenges and unmet needs, in addition to a few others, but those are the 2 I wanted to focus on for your subgrantees. So the challenges one asks subgrantees to discuss some of the challenges your victim assistance program faced during the course of the federal fiscal year. This is where it is your responsibility to explain to your subgrantees that they should be transparent and honest in their responses so you can best assist them moving forward and in future subgrantee awards that you are going to be awarding them. And also so you can respond to OVC and provide that information and move it up the chain around any challenges that OVC can be aware of and assist with. The second question is describing some of the services that victims needed but you could not provide, and what were the challenges that prevented you, the victim assistance organization or the subgrantee organization, from providing those services. Again, encouraging them and explaining to them that this doesn't mean that they will that they need to worry about more funding if they were honest and transparent in their response. This is only to help you and help OVC better understand what is happening at their level. So to summarize and provide some information, make sure that your responses are powerful and effective. What this means is make sure that you're providing enough context for OVC, make sure that you are providing examples, that you are pulling from the data, whether there's any increases or decreases, or really just anything that you think you need to speak to help our analysts and OVC better understand why the numbers look the way that they do. And also be honest, be open, and steer clear of answering with no, this doesn't apply to us, not applicable. Make sure that you are using that space to explain to OVC what is happening at your state, things that you'd like to share instead of, just providing one-word answers that would not be beneficial to your grant manager. Ask your team or partners to contribute stories and work together as a team to respond. One person should not be completing this 22-question report on their own. This should be a team effort at the state level to make sure that all different perspectives are taken into consideration when you provide your responses. Then be specific and use evidence from the PMT data to support your responses. And make sure that you discuss the performance management plan with your subgrantees to better capture the data and the outcomes and to better be able to speak to their experience and to their grant activity within your annual report at the state level. Also, train your subgrantees on the performance measures and hold them accountable, and hold your staff and yourselves accountable when monitoring subgrantees to make sure that they are reporting accurately and correctly and that you can use their data to inform your annual reports. This leads us to the end of our session. I wanted to also share with you that our webpage has the performance measures listed on there if you need a copy of those. We also have user guides around the PMT system and the performance measures. We have online recorded trainings. This one will be available later in the month, but others like this training are also available on our webpage. But if you have any additional questions, or if there was a question that came from this session, please feel free to reach out to us at the OVCPMT Help Desk. We can schedule a one-on-one session. We can schedule a refresher for your team. We could talk about the annual report or really anything around performance reporting with your VOCA funds that you'd like to discuss. Our sessions range from 30 minutes to an hour or even 10 minutes, but we'd love to hear from you and provide TTA to you so we can help you better complete your performance reports. I wanted to also share the contact information for our help desk and the Just Grants help desk, so you have it. I will be sharing these slides after this presentation, so you will have that information readily available to you. And I also wanted to ask that you share any feedback that you have with me today. If you'd like to stay on and type it out in the chat, that's wonderful. If you'd like to respond through an email and provide us feedback, that would be great as well. We're looking for one thing from today that you think you'll be able to use in the upcoming annual report. I hope all of it, but if not, at least one item would be great. And if you had anything you would change about this training, what would it be? And what kind of topics would you like to see in the future for trainings or resources that you would like from our team? Okay, so while you do that, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and for contributing to the responses. And we look forward to hearing from you, and good luck with your reporting.